You need to switch off your. Let's see. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Before I introduce you, I'd just like to say, with thanks in Winner's Manor and organisers who host us here each time. Thank you very much, and for the residents who organise that for us. We don't take it for granted. We just want to assure you that we're really grateful. Jenny Morris is going to speak about the longitude problem. That's slightly less of an astronomy problem, although it's an astronomy problem to do with navigation and so on, how to solve it. Quite an interesting story. Some of you might know that, but it's very interesting. Jenny is an excellent speaker. She always gives a great presentation. So we look forward to it, Jenny. Go ahead.
Thank you, Derek. I assume he's going to get rid of the banner at the top.
The lights. No, we see light on your post, don't push that light.
Is that okay?
The banner at the top. The banner at the top.
Yeah, it's the banner at the top, Derek.
Oh.
That's got to go.
What is it?
I don't know.
There we go.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everybody. Please let me know if you have trouble hearing me. Thank you very much for coming out on a chilly winter's evening. I hope you enjoy the presentation. For some backgrounds, the problem we're going to look at solution that history came up with.
We just try some speaker. Oh goodness. But it is right off.
We had this problem last time as well.
Let's try that.
There's still an echo, I think. I can hear it.
Anybody?
Obviously, we can hear, that's fine.
Anybody else connected to Zoom?
That'll be fine.
Have you got your mic? Mute the day. Yeah.
I think that seems okay. Yeah, I can't hear an echo. Okay, I'm glad we were only at the beginning. So, lines of latitude are actually very easy to understand and calculate. They're parallel. They have degrees, for fixed degrees of 0 at the equator up to 90 degrees at the poles. And they're relatively easy to calculate, even at sea, based on the length of the day, the height of the sun above the horizon during the day, and the height of known guide stars above the horizon at night. So I've got to use 2 hands. Sorry. Lines of longitude are a completely different story. There's no agreed 0, it's an arbitrary position. It involves curves, not lines, as you can see on the drawing. Distance east and west is different physically. Lines. So further north you go, the closer, the shorter the distances are, long ones at the equator. At sea, you have the additional problem of trying to measure accurately on a moving surface. Fundamentally, the way to solve measuring longitude anywhere but at sea is that you need 2 pieces of information. You need to know local time on the boat, and you need to know the time at an agreed baseline location. So, for instance, if you've left London, you need to know what the time is in London as well as the time where you are. And the navigators used to do this by following the elevation of the sun. And then they will say, okay, the sun's at its highest, it's noon. And then they would often use something like, what are those things you turn over and the sand runs through? Yeah, the hourglass, thank you. And then somebody's job was to actually turn the hourglass every half hour. So they could monitor local time all the time, but you also needed to know the time at a baseline position, and that's where the problem arose. What navigators used to use was this system, so-called dead reckoning, which is basically sort of guesswork, and unfortunately often ended up with dead being real. There were a lot of accidents. We know about a lot of them off the coast here, for example. It's all about estimating. There are certain things that could be measured on the boat: the speed, the direction, and the latitude. So you then had to estimate how you sail to a destination. And what they did was that they would sail down to a known latitude and then just travel along with latitude in the hope that they actually hit the place they're trying to reach.
Ooh.
It's scary. I mean, if North and South America weren't linked, then Columbus could still be going. And this was how he had to do it. The estimates were also unable to account for the effects of wind and tides, and particularly sea currents, so that they had no idea where their ships actually were. Method was often based on inaccurate maps, and this example here is a 1489 map, which is the sort of thing that Columbus might have used. And you can see it's a little inaccurate, but they're working with very limited knowledge. And on top of that, at a local level, they were often unreliable, inadequate, or actually absent values of factors like depth soundings and depth recordings. So you might even get there and then find that you'd mount the rocks like the Birkenhead did. So it was a very unsatisfactory process. Led to a lot of numerous proposals being made on how to solve this longitude problem. Some astronomical, others non-astronomical. Because people were aware that the moon and the sun move across the sky against the fixed stars, which are so far away they're effectively immobile. And they move in a fixed cycle. So there was the potential to use the stars and the moon and the sun as a sort of astronomical clock in the absence of anything else. And if you could link the information from the cosmos with what's happening at the baseline place with what's happening where you are, then potentially you could have 2 lots of time that you needed. Some of these suggestions included observation of solar and lunar eclipses, because again, they happen on a cyclical basis. But it's completely impractical. Often you're not in the right place when an eclipse happens. They're very rare events. And early efforts were shown this to be very inaccurate. Even Columbus tried this and found it didn't help. In 1610, Galileo, one of the first people to use a telescope, identified the cyclical patterns of which the 4 Galilean moons move around Jupiter. So theoretically, those could be used. And in fact, he went to great lengths to try and develop devices which could do this, like these 2 very scary-looking celotomes. And what you imagine, you're standing on a moving ship, you need to keep an eye on where Jupiter is, and also be able to see these tiny little moons. Now, there are no original copies there are no original instruments available, but these are copies based on diagrams. So some poor person had to wear these metal things and try and do this. They're not really feasible. Then there was the lunar distance method, which was the most practical, but needed to be built from scratch, and I'll come back to it. Non-astronomical methods, some of which were completely wrong, others were bizarre, to put it mildly, and there were the occasional ones which had a possibility to succeed. The tip of a magnetic compass was great if you wanted latitude, but it didn't give you longitude. Magnetic variation was a possibility, which is the distance between the north the angle between the north and the magnetic, sorry, between true north and magnetic north, which people knew varied in different places. But they basically found that it varied too much in too many different places to be useful and was unpredictable. A little more bizarre, we had cannons shooting rockets at known times from anchored signal ships. Think about this one. The idea was the sailors could then factor in the speed of light and the speed of sound to calculate their position. And even more weird was this telepathic yelp of wounded dogs, which I don't have time to go into, but let's say psychic powers were not going to solve the problem. The one with the potential, which would be the most straightforward, was to come up with a clock which would work at sea. Pendulum clocks had been developed in the 1600s, but they only worked on land and they needed a stable base. At sea, the pendulum was useless, and this is where the challenge was, to build a clock that could work at sea accurately. So the lunar distance method was first proposed in 1474 by a German mathematician, but actually formally developed and proposed in 1514 by Julius Werner. And it's relatively straightforward. The calculation isn't hugely complicated, but the theory is fairly straightforward. Is that you record stars' positions along the moon's path, so you can then compare moon and stars. And they, as I said, they work on a cycle, so they're patterns. You also need to record the relative daily positions of the moon and the sun, because you need to be able to calculate longitude and day as well as night. This data then allows prediction of the alignments, because you know the pattern, and you can then take it forward and produce a set of a pattern of that's going to happen. You then have to put all this data into a set of timetables, which actually then the navigator consults and uses. Sounds easy, but the realities, practicalities are very, very challenging. On board ship, the navigator looks at his tables and says, okay, the moon was this distance from the star X at noon in London. It's now looking that way here. And I know that the local time here is 2 o'clock. Therefore, we are 2 hours ahead or behind of London. We'll go behind. We're going west. And once you know that, you can then actually work out the degrees of longitude, because there are 15 degrees of longitude for every hour. So if you do the calculation in that basis, you would say, okay, we're 30 degrees west, and they know their longitude. The actual mathematics is incredibly complicated. They've got to deal with refraction, parallax, etc., etc. But the principle is relatively straightforward once you've got the data. Sorry, I need to. And in 1671, John Flamsteed, a young astronomer, met King Charles II and pointed out to him that the astronomers at the Paris Observatory were planning to work on the lunar distance method. And the king had to take action because the French were not popular with the British. They were competing economically, they were competing politically. And so this became a challenge. And the start of the formal finding of longitude began. In March 1675, the king created the position of astronomical observator, which later became the Astronomer Royal. And the royal warrant stated that the role of this person was to apply himself with the most exact care and diligence to the rectifying of the tables of the motions of the heavens and the place of the fixed stars, so as to find out the so much desired longitude of places for the perfecting of the art of navigation. This was an entirely practical undertaking. In March 1675, Flamsteed was appointed as the first observator. He was only 29 years old, but obviously knew the right people. He was in post for 44 years. And his task was to undertake a new survey of the northern skies using a telescope. As I said, it had only been really invented in 1610, so this is 65 years later. And he had to improve the best existing catalogue, which has been made by Tycho Brahe using open sight, i.e. eyesight. In June, the king formally commissioned the Royal Observatory. Things happened quickly. And in August, Flamsteed laid the first cornerstone for the building, which is now called Flamsteed House at the Royal Observatory in Greenwich. Some of you may be familiar with it. In all the years he worked there, he made over 30,000 observations, all confirmed with telescopes, mostly bought by himself. There was money for buildings, but there wasn't much for equipment. He developed a meticulous star catalogue of over 3,000 stars, tripling that of Brahe. And these are not telescopes like we think of today. These are very rudimentary pieces, often with metal as the reflector. They didn't have mirrors and things in those days. So he actually did an amazing job. But concerned for his reputation, he refused to release the unverified data, arguing that he wasn't paid enough to be forced to publish them before he was ready. So we're really getting some sort of human element to this. In 1704, which is about 30 years after he came, Isaac Newton, who was president of the Royal Society, persuaded him to hand over some of his records. And Newton started piecemeal publication of a star catalogue over the coming years. But this stopped when Flamsteed refused to release further data. It took a royal warrant in 1710 to make Flamsteed hand over his information, and he was not happy. It required him to hand over all his records to Newton, who gave them to a gentleman called Edmund Halley, who you may have heard of, who collated and edited the material. He did try and involve Flamsteed in the process, but Flamsteed said no. In 1712, the Historia Celestis was published. Flamsteed obtained 300 of the 400 copies and burned them. He eventually died after his 44 years. And his wife edited his data. I'm not quite sure how she had the skills, but she edited this. And there was a posthumous publication of Historia Celestis, which the lower picture is an image, which contained his catalogue of these 3,000 stars. The next stage of this process is a few years later, when in 1707, an appalling naval disaster occurred off the Isles of Scilly, when 4 of the 15 ships in a flotilla traveling north and was heading towards Plymouth ended up on the rocks, and up to 2,000 sailors died. Disasters like this weren't new, but this was on a scale that actually got the government's attention, and something happened. In 1714, still took them a while, the British government passed an act for providing a public reward for such personal persons as shall discover the longitude at sea. The act established commissioners for the discovery of longitude at sea, which became known as the Board of Longitude, or the Board. Members included scientists, academics, naval officers, politicians, government officials, and clergy. It wasn't small. And the scientists included whoever was the astronomer royal at the time. Were £10,000 if you managed to come up with a method that determined longitude to within 60 nautical miles, £15,000 for within 14 nautical miles, and the top prize was £20,000 for a method accurate to within 30 nautical miles. £20,000 in those days would be £3 million today, which would still be a substantial amount of money. You can see how much pressure there was and expectation there was that this process is successful. The actual accuracy of the method that's been submitted would then be tested on one of Her Majesty's ships as it sailed over the ocean from Great Britain to any such port in the West Indies as those commissioners chose, without losing their longitude beyond the limits before mentioned. So you can understand why there were people interested in solving this problem. Huge financial incentive. One of whom was a gentleman. Now, Harrison wasn't from the establishment. He was not from the top levels of society. He was a northerner, for one thing, and he was a carpenter and self-educated clockmaker. So he always had to fight an unspoken social stigma on top of all his other issues. In 1727, so this is 13 years after the Act came into being, age 34, he set out to measure longitude at sea with a reliable clock. This was a daunting task. It had to consistently maintain accurate time on lengthy, rough sea voyages, accommodate widely varying temperatures, pressures, and humidity, be unaffected by varying directions and extents of the three-dimensional motion of the ocean, and be impervious to salt corrosion. Just a few little expectations. I've already mentioned Edmund Halley. He comes into the picture now. He had some understanding of the longitude issue because in 1693, he had actually led the first purely British scientific naval voyage. And one of the things he tested was this magnetic variation possibility. So he was aware of this. In 1720, he was appointed the second Astronomer Royal after Flamsteed died. And his main focus was on the moon. Flamsteed had done a lot of the observations on the stars. Now the next stage was to understand the moon's characteristics. And over the 22 years of his position, he made observations day and night of the lunar elliptical orbit against the fixed stars to get a full Saronic or lunar cycle. In 1730, so we're now even more years beyond the start of the longitude prize, Harrison sought Halley's input, because Halley was a board member. As I said, the Astronomer Royal was a member on the board. So Harrison sought Halley's input on his plans for a marine clock. Halley was very supportive, despite the fact he was involved in trying to develop the lunar distance method. And he referred Harrison to a leading innovative clockmaker called George Graham, who was called Honest George. Makes you wonder what others were. He did this because Graham would be a better judge of Harrison's design than the astronomers, mathematicians, etc., who dominated board membership. Graham was very supportive and became a patron, as well as actually giving him an interest-free loan. And Harrison began his 5-year task of building the first marine clock. This was called Harrison 1, always known as H1. It still works. 5 years later, Harrison presented H1 not to the Board of Longitude, but to the Royal Society. Graham was a member of was a fellow of the Royal Society, and obviously said, okay, let's look at it this way. Let's go and get the Royal Society's feedback before you take it to the board. H1 is not small, it's 62 centimeters tall and weighs 34 kilos. But Halley and other members were impressed, and they persuaded the Admiralty to agree to a sea trial. And Harrison accompanied H1 on a trip to Lisbon and back. He discovered he was not a good sailor, but he did manage to make ongoing improvements. And in fact, on the return journey back to London, the mariners were very thankful to him because he showed them that they were actually going off course. Eventually, in 1737, which is now 23 years since the board was established, it met for the first time. And actually, Harrison therefore presented H1. Unfortunately, rather than requesting a sea trial to Jamaica, he criticized the clock, requesting extra time. And this became a pattern. Following another 3 years' work plus 2 years of testing, he presented what is now H2 to the board, his second clock. Also tall, 68 centimeters, much heavier, 39 kilos, although it was more compact and robust. But he again noticed defects and withdrew it without requesting a sea trial. Instead, he asked for further funding so he could work on a better clock. I mean, he was dependent on Longitude to actually pay a salary. There was probably some income coming in from his business because his brother worked with him, but he needed the board support. Oh, I apologize. Sorry. Oh, yeah, sorry. 5 years later, H3 was ready for testing, but Harrison continued to work on it for years to come. Harrison was doing all this. James Bradley became the third Astronomer Royal following Halley's death in 1742. Before this, he had been a supporter of H1, but his allegiance switched entirely to the lunar distance method. He continued to work on accurate observations of the skies and sort of continued the work on lunar orbit. In 1757, he enthusiastically received a set of lunar tables from a completely different direction, unexpectedly, which had been developed by a German Tobias Mayer, not for use at sea or solving longitude, but in fact to help him make accurate maps of the land. But he leapfrogged the whole lunar development because suddenly they had a set of tables to work with. The comparison of the tables with Royal Observatory observations was found so accurate that in fact they had potentially found longitude, or could find longitude within half a degree, which was the prize. So Bradley arranged for tables to be tested at sea for 7 years. And the results were so encouraging that even after Mayer died unexpectedly, the board awarded his widow £3,000 in recognition of his contribution. So this was a great leap forward for the lunar distance method. In the meantime, Harrison was plugging away at his H3, which he finally pretended had ready after 19 years of work. And unfortunately, those 19 years were in some ways wasted because technology was moving on. And by the time he presented H3 to the board, which he didn't want to do, but he had to because basically they'd funded it, he knew that the technology on clocks and watches had advanced a long way past his clock. Again, it was still 62 centimeters tall, this time much lighter, 27.3 kilos. It had 753 pieces and parts, including several innovations. So he presented it to the board, but aware that the small precision watch was as accurate as his large sea clocks, he basically sort of said, no, I'm working on the next one. At the same time, Bradley, who now had an interest in supporting the astronomical side route, used the excuse of the 7 years war to oppose sea tests of H3, even though the lunar tables were still being tested during the war. H3 never went to sea. Tell me if I have missed moving on. There's the picture of it. H4 looks completely different. It is a watch. You can see it's a watch. So only 1 year later, Harrison presented H4. So he'd clearly been working on it for a long time. Presented to the board his first sea watch. The diameter, about 5 inches, about 12.5 centimeters, and weighed 1.5 kilos, 3 pounds. It cost £400, which was a third of the value of a ship. Sure. Anyway, the board said, fine, okay, go do a sea trial. So in 1761, a year later, his son William Harrison took H4 on a sea trial to Jamaica. William alleged with evidence that Bradley had delayed departure to enable Neville Maskelyne, a name you're going to get familiar with, to test the lunar distance method on the voyage to St. Helena. So we've got a lot of vested interests. In 1762, William returned, knowing that H4 met all the requirements of the Act. Astronomer Royal, who actually was only in place for 2 years, but he also supported the lunar distance method and opposed Harrison's work. He was interested in clocks only and their value for improving astronomical measurements. In 1764, William was sent to Barbados because even though one test was required under the law, the board decided they needed to have a second test, a sea trial. So H4 and William went to Barbados, and when he got there, he discovered Mr. Masculine already there, publicly claiming that his lunar distance method was the best thing. When they actually looked at their results, the outcome was that H4 kept time with longitude error of less than 10 miles, while the lunar method had an error of less than 30 miles, involved more work and greater navigational skills. Despite this, when they got back to London, Bliss supported the board's claim that H4's accuracy was lucky. The picture on the left bottom is actually the workings of H4. Beautiful piece. Despite the lucky claim by the board, their final report on H4 did acknowledge that they were unanimously of the opinion that the said timekeeper has kept its time with sufficient correctness. So Harrison was awarded half the top reward, and there were numerous conditions attached. So one of the conditions was that he hand over all his clocks plus the full H4 design details. Also, the balance of the full 20,000 prize was awarded only if Harrison, who was now 71 years old, produced 2 copies of H4, built without drawings and able to both work as well as the original. The premise then was that they needed proof that H4 design could be used and bulk produced, could be duplicated. The lunar distance method, which had obviously been progressing in parallel with this, they'd met several of the requirements. The position of the stars had been met by the first Astronomer Royal. Mission and positions of the lunar orbit were known also by the Astronomers Royal. An instrument to measure the critical distances between the moon and the sun had been developed in 1731, when a British and an American scientist independently devised the reflecting quadrant, or which was known as an octant, and was the forerunner of the sextant, which is, I think, still in use. So they had a lot of the prerequisites for this. The next stage was that they needed the detailed lunar tables to translate these instrument readings into longitude positions. And this is a job that Neville Maskelyne took on and championed. Just a reminder, he'd been on the scientific voyage to St. Helena to test Mayer's tables. He'd also been on the trip to Barbados to test the accuracy of lunar distance against H4. And then a year later after that, he was appointed the 5th Astronomer Royal. And he used his position on the board to oppose the timekeepers, delaying awarding of money, encouraging the board to make additional demands. This is a difficult man to like. In the same year, another new Longitude Act was passed. We often think of the Longitude Act as a single act, but in fact, there were numerous iterations of it over many years. But this is possibly the most challenging one, was the 1765 or 1766 amendment of the Act. It added caveats and further conditions for submissions, although it legally backed both the timekeeper and the lunar distance methods. Maskelyne was one of a group, including 2 watchmakers, Larkham Kendall and Thomas Mudge, whose notice will come up again, who observed and watched Harrison, the 71-year-old man, dismantle H4 and under oath explain its design and function of each component. He then had to reassemble H4, show it worked, hand it over for storage, without access to his drawings or writings. And then he was meant to be going to produce his replicas. The humiliation is just appalling, in my opinion. And in 1766, a year later, the board demanded additional tests for all 4 clocks to be undertaken at the Royal Observatory by Neville Maskelyne. Lunar distance method. In 1763, so this is just before he became Astronomer Royal, Maskelyne published the British Mariner's Guide, English translation of Mayer's tables and directions on its use for calculating longitude. The board then agreed the proposal that for annual publication of the guide and the pre-calculated tables. And in 1767, the first edition of the Nautical Almanac, an astronomical ephemeris and its companion requisite tables, was published. All the distances were calculated from the Greenwich meridian, because that's where all the astronomers were based. The pre-calculated data reduced the number of calculations needed, making the method practical, and shortened the time to derive a position from 4 hours to around about 30 minutes. I wouldn't have wanted to be a navigator before these became available. Interestingly, the Nautical Almanac, despite the fact that we have GPS, is still published annually. There are obviously times when people need to get back to their pens and paper. I already said that the board demanded these tests of Harrison's clocks. So H1, 2, and 3 were moved to the observatory, and their rates were all compared with the large regulated clock there. Despite nearly perfect performances on 2 sea trials, the board decided H4 needed further rigorous testing. It was moved from the Admiralty storage to the observatory for 10 months of daily testing, at the end of which Maskelyne stated that H4 did not meet the required specifications to be trusted at sea. However, he did recognize its value in increasing the accuracy of astronomical measurements when the latter was not possible in bad weather or when the moon was opposite the sun. Maskelyne's message was clear: H4 could enhance the lunar method but not replace it. After the tests, all 4 clocks were locked away in poor conditions and ignored until 1836. In 1770, so 5 years after he deconstructed H4, Harrison, now 77 years old, completed H5, which was one of the duplicates. He never got around to doing the second one. So he did the duplicate without, and the only information he had was his own memory and a poorly written pamphlet on H4's design, which had been produced by Maskelyne. H4 and 5 is identical to H4 internally, although the exterior is more austerely designed or decorated, which may suggest or reflect his mindset. So it was developed over 3, built over 3 years and tested it for another 2. At the same time, the board refused Harrison's request that H4 be taken on sea voyages. I mean, this was the purpose of all this, was to actually come up with methods which could be used at sea in a practical way. They required that it be stored until the status of the remainder of the Longitude prize was resolved. This on the top right is a very famous portrait you often see of Harrison, and people assume that this is H4, but in fact it's not, because H4 is much bigger. This is about half the size. And in fact, this is a proper watch, which was built for Harrison by a colleague to Harrison's specifications. And it's like he took what he'd done on the marine, his little marine one, his big marine one, and had it fitted down into one he could put in his pocket. And a little later in time, somebody had repainted the portrait without this, because now this was meant to be the watch. The H4 was in the Admiralty storage room. In 1772, son William wrote to King George III, summarizing the events of the past decades and asking that H5 be tested at the King's new private observatory in Richmond. At the meeting with William, the King was appalled. "These people have been cruelly treated," he stated, "and by God, William, I will see you righted." H5 was found to be accurate to within a third of a second per day. The King appealed directly to the Prime Minister for justice, and after investigating the board's actions, Parliament awarded Harrison, now 80, the balance he was owed. However, he only got £8,750 because the amounts were now subject to the restricted pattern of the amended Act. So he was cheated out of his final money. And the prize itself was never awarded as such. Nobody said, "You won the prize." Nobody was ever given that. The outcome of the Longitude battle was that Harrison died 3 years later. An inscription on his family tomb states that he was the inventor of the timekeeper for ascertaining the longitude at sea. About 35 years later, Maskelyne died, and the plaque inside the parish church in Wiltshire, where he was buried, records that the Astronomer Royal worshipped the great creator by formulating the laws of nature. There was no mention of longitude. And when William Harrison died, it was added to the family tomb was an inscription that said, recognized his role as the custodian of H4 on the 2C trials and his active support of his father in the long and difficult negotiations with the Board of Longitude and Parliament when claiming the £20,000 prize. So let's look at what Act 1 has shown us. Time demonstrated that chronometers were more accurate, and easier to use, but they were very expensive. And for many years, the lunar distance method was the viable option. And its use was reinforced annually by the updated tables, which were circular, or updated almanac, which was available. But overall, history shows that with Maskelyne and others who might have won the battle, that Harrison and his successors won the war. So that's the end of Act 1. I'm sorry, is it okay if I go over time a bit?
Yeah, I'm sure.
Are you sure? Sorry, I'm rambling a bit. We've got some other characters in the story. Larkham Kendall was one of the watchmakers that actually watched Harrison disassemble H4. And in 1767, he was hired by the board to produce an exact copy of H4. I remember this disassembly being 1765. He presented what became known as K1, Kendall 1, in 1770, and it was a sea watch. And he was awarded £500 by the board. Sorry, I'm not getting pictures. H4, this is it's an identical copy, although there are some small differences on the front. K1 was sent on Captain James Cook's second voyage, not H4 as Harrison had requested. Cook was initially skeptical, but his log recorded, "Our trusted friend the watch," this thing actually got a name, so it was like a person, "and our never failing guide the watch." And the second voyage took place mostly in the Southern Ocean, dealing with the roaring 40s and the furious 50s, etc. But it was this clock, or this sea watch, which enabled Cook to undertake voyages like that, and actually opened up exploration, because it was much more efficient. You could imagine trying to do lunar tables when you're on a heaving sea, just north of the ice shelves. Cooking, as I said, K2, the second Larkham Kendalls, was simpler and faster, but didn't work as well. And the same was with K3. So it was cheaper, but less accurate. Although K1 and K3 were used on Cook's third voyages. And in fact, K3 was involved in several voyages, significant voyages by people like Vancouver, when they discovered that looking for Northwest Passage, etc. Was at the same time that Kendall was doing his thing, John Arnold was requested by Maskelyne. So Maskelyne took a liking to Arnold to build a watch as accurate as H4, but more economically. Arnold presented the model a few years later, very different design from H4. And 3 Arnold watches went on Cook's second voyage, but in fact they did not survive the heaving seas and all the other challenges. The board actually reduced his funding, but he persisted and took out the first of 2 patents to monitor improvements. Now, interestingly, Harrison never patented anything. In 1779, what's called Arnold 36, which is on the bottom, was the first true pocket chronometer. And so, not surprisingly, it passed all the observatory tests. And Arnold, in fact, began bulk manufacturing and by contracting out routine work. Smudge, who'd also watched Harrison deconstruct H4, decided to get in on the bandwagon. And he started on his own watch. Again, lots of money at stake. In 1774, about the same time, he submitted a chronometer for testing. He was awarded the money, but failed Maskelyne's observatory tests. Mudge complained that the results were biased towards John Arnold, and a protracted dispute began along similar lines to the ones Harrison had had. In 1777, to meet the demands of the new act, he built 2 identical chronometers. Similar colors, we've got green and blue. They were identical internally and just had different colors outside. Maskelyne stated that both had failed the Royal Observatory test. Mudge tried to go into business and start mass production, but he wasn't very successful. Some years later, his son unsuccessfully defended his father's watches to the board, who awarded a £3,000 to Mudge in recognition of his contributions. Our last major character, Earnshaw. In 1780, he started copying and modifying Arnold's designs, so we're in direct competition with each other. He focused on simple, accurate, basic designs. His innovations made small, accurate, economic timekeepers available to the general public. Arnold's greatest professional rival, and they fought for years over the patents, because there were patents which Arnold had, which he accused Mudge of stealing, even when he was still under the protected. So there was an ongoing dispute with Arnold around the patents, and Earnshaw had to wait several years before the patents expired before he could use those advances. These pictures are various examples of some of Earnshaw's clocks or watches, marine chronometers. Arnold died, but that wasn't the end of the story. And eventually the board tried to resolve this dispute and obtained testaments from ships' captains and agents on the quality of Arnold and Earnshaw chronometers. Egged on by Maskelyne, who was now an Earnshaw supporter, he didn't keep friends very long. The board concluded that Earnshaw's chronometers were the best ever tested by the Royal Observatory. Eventually, they granted awards to both, £2,500 to Earnshaw and £1,672 to the Arnold family, because this is now a posthumous award. End of the story? No. Earnshaw then wrote pamphlets appealing to the public, claiming he'd been cheated. Arnold's son wrote to the board about Earnshaw's actions. And even 20 years, it took 20 more years before Earnshaw died, and this basically disappeared. But the basic Arnold Earnshaw designs have continued unchanged into the 20th century. If you've got your grandfather's watch from the 1910s or 20s, it may be one of these Arnold Earnshaw designs. The outcome of the rivalry was that strong competition actually led to mass production and ever cheaper timekeepers. So from £400 for H4, prices dropped to 65 to 65 to 85 pounds. And the demand from the naval and merchant captains was very high, often at their own expense. As an example, William Bligh purchased an Earnshaw for his second breadfruit jewel. Remember, he was thrown off by Fletcher Christian at the first one, and they all mutinied. He was then sent out to try and do this again, and he took an Earnshaw with him. And this time he had a successful trip, which is actually commemorated in these examples, these 2 stamps. So this is an example of how these ships' captains were prepared to pay to buy chronometers because they were so useful. Even though the use of cheaper lunars still continued, the chronometers were becoming cheaper and easier to use. On the Beagle, which we probably heard of, there were no fewer than 22 chronometers. And you think, why? They included 5 Arnolds and 2 Earnshaws. And the number was determined by the objectives of the voyage, which were twofold. One was the popular one, or known one, was the Hydrographic Survey of South America, which obviously needed very accurate readings and it took them years. I mean, it was a 5-year project. And then less publicly known, Robert Fitzroy, the captain, was asked or instructed to establish a chain of points of precise longitude around the globe. So he needed very accurate equipment. Bear in mind at this time that British were trying to undermine the Spanish Empire, and they were literally chasing after their galleons full of gold and spices and, taking them over or sinking them. So there was a lot of vested interests economically in this. They needed large chronometer numbers in the case of a breakdown or malfunction during a 4-year or a long voyage, damage from repeated handling at sea and on land, and variations in accuracy of different timekeepers. But overall, they all proved to be very successful. Longitude Act was still in place, and the last of the 23 acts relating to longitude was passed in 1828. So it ran for 114 years. This was in fact called the National Almanac Act. In it, the Board of Longitude was dissolved and all existing legislation repealed. The Act's main purpose was to provide a legal framework for accurate, regular, official publication of the Nautical Almanac by the Admiralty, so no longer the responsibility of the Astronomers Royal. It's estimated that over the 114 years, the board dispersed approximately £100,000. And again, money might have been paid out, but the prize was never awarded. I have a 2-minute we got okay for time?
Yeah.
Postscript. 1836, now we're looking at it, I said after the board had been disbanded. The 7th Astronomer Royal, George Biddle Airy, was appointed. And he established the most accurate prime meridian at Greenwich. Because all the measurements that the astronomers had made, people like Halley and Flamsteed, were done in Greenwich, Greenwich effectively then became the prime meridian, just by convention. Worth bearing in mind, there have been a lot of, remember I said that longitude had no fixed zero. There have been a lot of arbitrary points that have been the prime meridian. Over time, it's included Madeira, the Azores, Rome, Copenhagen, Jerusalem, St. Petersburg, Pisa, Paris, Philadelphia. I mean, anyone could say we are the prime meridian. And in fact, the French were very unhappy when it went to London. In 1884, it was adopted. Sorry, have I not moved on? In 1884, the prime meridian of Greenwich was adopted internationally at a large multinational international conference in Washington, D.C. It was already being used. All the people who used the lunars were using prime meridian, and it just became an official thing. Some of you might and have 1 foot in the west and 1 foot in the east when you visited the Royal Observatory. I understand that the line, which is a strip of metal, is actually Airy's final line because it's a movable feast. The line is also marked, or has been marked since 1999, with a laser at night. But in fact, it is no longer zero. With GPS and other measurements, in fact, the modern calculations place the Greenwich meridian about 102 meters east of the existing line. But that doesn't matter because it's not used as such anymore. And once you have a prime meridian, you have a global time system. So the establishment of the prime meridian to the establishment of a global time system with Greenwich Mean Time as the sort of baseline. Time balls were established at numerous places. Greenwich got one in 1833, and this enabled ships to set their chronometers. I'm sure we've all seen the one at the waterfront in Cape Town, even though it doesn't work anymore. But there are places where they do them. I know Sydney has their time ball drops at 1 o'clock every day. But GMT is no longer with us. In 1960, it began to be replaced with Coordinated Universal Time, or UTC, which is based on the weighted average of worldwide atomic clocks, not on astronomical observations. And in 1963, UTC became the official global time system. I hope you've enjoyed learning or hearing about the narrative which shows how human nature is a very important part and not that can influence rational science in the solving of large problems. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. If anybody's got questions, maybe we can use the mics when we've got one.
Do we have time?
Yeah. Any questions?
I'm assuming that the Harrison chronometer and the other watches that were produced were spring wound.
Yeah, I've only seen pictures. Sorry, I don't have a voice anymore. Thanks, Derek. I've only seen pictures and videos of these. The 4 of them are actually in a museum, which I think is actually physical. It's a part of the National Maritime Museum, but I think they're actually based at the old observatory at Greenwich. And you can actually see the springs on H1 still working, because obviously the pendulum wouldn't work. But yeah, they seem to be spring-based. I'm not a horologist. I do understand that that H4, the little clock, isn't working because he had to leave out some of the components to get it small enough, and so it hasn't worked. And every time I touch it, it potentially becomes damaged or affect the thing. So it's there, and these things just have to be wound, and they're still working.
There was some sailor or captain or something had to go and wind the watch every so.
Yeah, I mean, initially when I said they'd been put away for and sort of were found again in 1836, the story, if I remember correctly, was that an ex-serviceman, I don't remember if it was Navy or Army, after the First World War, as part of his therapy, because he was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, but it wasn't in those days, but that's what it was. He undertook the job of actually refurbishing and rebuilding and, if you know, that's the word I'm looking for, revamping these 4H, this H1 to 3, 4, and he spent years restoring. Thank you. And he spent several years doing this, so we have him to thank. And apparently, it was very therapeutic for him to sit and fiddle with all these tiny mechanisms and take his mind off his problems. But if you're interested, look for videos on this. YouTube's got a lot. And it's fascinating that you get the guy talking, and you can see the clock H1 doing this. And you can see the spring working, and it's been doing this for 300 years. It's extraordinary. So anything else?
Anybody else?
It's interesting that the British were the guys pushing the wind-up clock for accuracy on longitude, and then the Americans took over in the 1960s with atomic clocks. But what was very interesting is that the Navy was involved in both countries. So it was British Navy in the first place, and now the American Navy. And now the American Navy is custodian of the actual very accurate atomic clocks using the cesium atom.
Yeah.
So it has to do, and from the Navy, from the American Navy, came the impetus to develop the GPS system. And the GPS system is critical for weapon accuracy in the modern era.
Yeah. Sorry, Derek. I was surprised to discover that the almanac is still published. I thought, who would need this? But apparently there are times when, I'm not a navigator, but apparently there are times when access to literally hard copies are necessary when somebody, for instance, doesn't have GPS or they're unable to use it for whatever reason. So it's still published, and then you can find it's on electronic format free on the internet. I don't know if they actually still produce a hard printed copy, but it is still in use. And the fact that they go to the expense, even though it's obviously the numbers are generated probably by computers, it still has to be published as such. It's still done. There must be a reason to keep it going. But I just was very surprised that this almanac is still available. I don't know if anyone's got any more information on why they still use it.
I download it every year.
Oh, yeah. Why? Tell you why you use it.
Amongst others, to get updated equation of time, and then to derive a simple formula in various sundials. But it is a very useful document, and it's very useful, obviously, for celestial navigation. And that's why the navies play such an important role. Why it played such an important role in navies.
Yeah, I mean, at sea, that was the challenge. You know, finding out time on land was easy, but not at sea.
Who among you took their first watch apart like I did when I was a kid? I still can't fix it.
Mm. Does anyone want to know about the yelping dog?
Not really.
It's very quick.
Sounds horrific.
It's mind blowing. Initially, when I went through this, I gave the dog, and I thought, no, it's getting too much time. I'm going to get rid of the dog. There was a quite powerful, let's say, social media frenzy in the 1600s, using about psychic powers. And a bit like witches were, you know, big bad thing then. There was a lot of stuff going on, even in those days. Now, the theory is that you take a dog and you injure it deliberately, which is problematic. You then either keep the bandage you use or the actual knife that you use to injure the dog in the hands of a trusted person at the base port, the base location, let's say London. At a fixed time, he reliably touches this bandage or the weapon. And the dog, who's now at sea on this boat that's heading wherever it's going, yelps when this bandage or the thing is touched. Somehow there's some psychic connection. I looked this up. It was quite bizarre. There were people who said they'd been cured, you know, when they were on holiday in America for some injury which had happened when they were in France 20 years earlier. I mean, well, you know, times don't change, people don't change, you know. But it was the most bizarre. And the fact that the person who put this forward was quite a reputable, he was a lord of something. I mean, he was a reputable member of the establishment. And they looked into this, you know, in theory. So that was the telepathic yelp of a wounded dog. But this is the sort of thing. And the weird thing with the cannons shooting out rockets, which you then had to see at speed of light, yes, that we're such and such a distance, came from two leading mathematicians, one at the University of Oxford and one at Cambridge. So, you know.
Well, I seem to remember reading somewhere that a story about dogs during the world wars when their masters were overseas in battle, and they would lie on the front step of the house waiting for the master to come home, and when they died or were killed in battle overseas, they turned around, went inside, and never did that again. At the exact moment they were killed. There's a scientific evidence. It was on YouTube, so it must be true.
It must be true. Well, maybe I don't know.
Atomic entanglement.
Quantum entanglement is not weirder than that.
Maybe in 50 years' time we'll be looking back and saying these guys were right.
Okay.
Anyway,
I'm just going to check if we got any questions from the people on Zoom on chat.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, we just got from a US saying it's excellent presentation.
Okay, so we're all done.
Yes, almost. You took that bottle away. Whether you partake of alcohol, but an appreciation of all the stuff that they can do.
Thank you. That's very kind. Thank you very much, sir.
Excellent presentation. Thank you.
Margaret, I'm going to give it to you to keep. Look after. Well, I sort myself out here.
Thanks to the online people for attending. We're going to stop the recording now and end the meeting. Thank you.
I understand, but